Belview and Waughtown's influence on education, 157 years and counting. Beyond the Civil War, the Freedmen had two or three main priorities: opening churches, opening schools, and finding their family. And we see in Forsyth County, they established four schools. The one in Waughtown in 1866, which was the first, then the one in Salem Happy Hill in 1867, the one in Louisville in 1867, and the one in Clemensville also in 1868. There was also two schools opened nearby in Thomasville and Lexington in 1867. And people that moved into Belview did go to those schools in Thomasville as well as Lexington. We see from an article in the Weekly Standard from Raleigh, North Carolina, that a well-wisher from Waughtown did submit an article on behalf of the Freedmen School in Waughtown, in which they said, "The freedmen of this village," meaning Waughtown, "deserve praise for their efforts in raising and supporting a school. It is, as I believe, the first and only freedmen school in Forsyth. They organized a school for themselves, and the school is taught by Mr. W. G. Kerner." Again, this was published in the Weekly Standard in January of 1867. We also know from another source that there were black teachers in the school in Waughtown. From this source, Hostility and Hope, Black Education, as well, which is a book, as well as other records about the school. We see this file, this record from 1877 from Paulina Fries, the widow of Harris Fries, who started the Methodist Church in their house, Harry Fries also. We see how they reference in this document how they owned land, and their land was near, known as the Church and Schoolhouse Lot, all of Waughtown. It was opposite to that track. We see in the 1870 census, we see Wash Fries and Harriet Fries. Then we see the George Fries family, the Harris and Paulina Fries family, who this is about, as well as John Wright. And then we see Richard Reich as well, and Lucy, his wife, as well as his mother-in-law, Lottie Reich, also known as Lottie Hines Reich, and also Lottie Maston. In August of 1867, a meeting was held at the African American Church in Salem. And after a lecture by James Harris on education, he urged his friends to organize at once a schoolhouse. A separate and smaller meeting was then convened for that purpose. A committee of three men was formed from a large group that attended the first meeting, and these three were charged with carrying forth the school being built. And the committee was Alexander Vogler, Bob Waugh, and Louis Hagee. And Bob Waugh lived in Waughtown, and Louis Hagee had strong ties to Waughtown also. Here's a roster of the Freedmen School in Thomasville, and some were adults. And Clark, Klaus, Grimes, Locke, and Wagner families all attended that school, and they all have descendants or relatives today who are in Belview or lived in Belview, and also at First Waughtown. The schoolhouse was also used for more than just a school and a church. It was also used as a meeting center. And we find an article on the 5th of April, 1867 about a freedmen's meeting in Waughtown for the purpose of holding a Republican Union meeting. And the committee was appointed by the chairman to draft resolutions, and the committee was Robert Waugh, William Turner Butler, Richard Banner or Boner, Anthony McNeely, Banks Harrison, and Jacob Maston, all colored. Bob Waugh married Mary Hairston. They were in freedmen, and we see their children on the far right. The founders of the school in Salem consisted of Robert Waugh and also the school in Waughtown, who was a descendant of the James Waugh family and a former enslaved member, also a bootmaker, merchant, and politician. He married a Hairston, Mary Hairston, and their descendants consisted of a dynasty of politicians and folks that became very well off and also educators. Louis Hagee was the first black to build a brick house in Winston. He also was a minister, and he was the ancestor of the Workman family. George Fries owned property near the school in Waughtown, also on Morcenia Street. He was an ancestor of the Clara Caldwell family. Louis Foltz was the son of Phoebe and Botany, and he owned property near Old Lexington Road. and the slave quarters. And Harry Frees was the founder of the Black Methodist Church in Forsyth County. And Clark Light was a wheelwright, and he was the father of Lou Foy's sons, Lee and Arthur Foy, who were the siblings of Betty Foy Self and Will Foy. Who were some of the children that would attend the schools in Waughtown and also Salem later on? Frees, Foy, Banner, Wright, Maston, Isabella Butler White, Dr. James Francis Schober, and Addie C. Morris. Isabella Butler White, her father was who the Butler Street is named for, became an esteemed principal in Charlotte, and for whom the Isabella White School is named. We see her tombstone here, and her husband, who's a very famous minister, the Reverend Robert White. Addie Morris, we see her tombstone at the Belview Cemetery, and how she left money for the colored orphan home in her will. Addie, of course, was the daughter of Charles Morris and the stepdaughter of Jane Lineback Frees Morris, and they were neighbors. We see Addie as Adelaide, age 12, in the 1870 census, living in Waughtown. Some of her sisters would have been Emma Morris Simmons, who married the Reverend Pinkney Joyce, as well as the ancestor of the Charles family and many other families in the Waughtown area. Dr. James Francis Schober, the first licensed doctor in North Carolina, of course, was born in 1853 in Waughtown on the Waugh Plantation. His father was the white Francis Schober, a very prominent Moravian, and his mother was the enslaved Betsy Ann Waugh, and we see her tombstone in the Waughtown Cemetery, and she died in 1859, and he was then raised by his grandmother on the Waugh Plantation. We see in the 1879, there were all these schools now, black schools in Forsyth County. The number 6 school is the school in Belview, Waughtown. And the committee members for that school are W.T. Butler, John Waugh, and Sam Ratliff. And then the school number 18 is the Happy Hill Salem School, Alex Gates, Daniel Frees, and Louis Hagee. Number 6, of course, with the W.T. Butler is Isabella Butler White's father. Sam Ratliff is a blacksmith, and John Waugh, of course, is a politician, and Bob Waugh's son. Number 15 is Alex Frees, is one of those, and he is the patriarch of Bellevue's Foy, Carter, Green, Holman family. Number 2, Blues Creek, Sterling Campbell, is Reverend George W. Campbell's father. Frank Spees, we see, is a committeeman of the Broad-Based School, a Waughtown school, in 1881. And we see his tombstone in the Belview Cemetery, and also serving with him was W.T. Butler, and Frank Spees is the patriarch of the Hind, Self, and Mock family. There was also a school in Abbott's Creek or Georgetown in 1881. And again, many of these folk would have come into Belview after they became adults. But some of the parents whose children were in that school were the Reverend George Trainham and his brother Moses Trainham, Lord Kleinert, Andrew Hines, George Charles, Jesse M.D., and H. Raber. By the 1880s, Winston was working toward a graded school at the Depot Street School. The first principal was Samuel A. Waugh. He was the son of Richard Waugh and Susan Banner. He later moved to Charlotte. We see an article from 1884 when it says the colored graded school opened with good attendance, and it discusses how the superintendent, and there is Samuel Waugh, principal. Addie Morris also opened a school. She was employed by the Missionary Society of Chicago, and she opened the first school for black children in Winston. And with her help, many of the students went to Shaw University. We see the plaque on the left, and we see on the right a picture of the school, and that is probably her or her sister Emma Joyce in the black jacket. There was also the old Reading School and the old Belview School in Reynolds Grove, Centerville. A deed dated July 13th, 1896 records that George D. Reynolds sold land to the Public School Committee of District Number 6 for the colored race, and that committee consisted of George D. Reynolds, Reverend Pinkney Scales, who was the uncle of Reverend Pinkney Joyce, and Green Allen. Green Allen was a prominent postman and he is the grandfather of Martha Grimes Holland and the late Mrs. Thomas White. You see the Belview, the old Belview School mentioned in the 1902 and 04 Walsh directories, and also by 1905 it's referred to as the Belview School. Leaders of the school of this era were George Penn, Professor A.J. Brown, Minnie Galloway, and Walter Hawkins, and many later married Reverend Pinkney Scales. We do see that, of course, the Belview School was near Belview and near the train tracks. And this is just an article about the George Reynolds death in 1918. Around 1905, the colored black orphanage was founded in Waughtown, actually in Belview of Waughtown. The Colored Orphanage Society consisted of Addie Morris, Reverend George W. Holland, Reverend Pinkney Joyce, James Timlick, and Eliza Yoakley. Eliza was also living in Waughtown, of course, as was Reverend Joyce and Addie Morris. Reverend Holland had lived there at one time also. We see the picture of the orphan home on the top right. From left to right on the bottom, and of course, there's the marker, Reverend Holland and Reverend Joyce. Why Riviera Street? So in the 1890s, the Wachovia Development Corporation began selling lots to blacks and whites in what is now known as Belview. In 03-05, the Colored Orphanage was organized on Riviera Street. And so by 1913, this was a hub. And so at the time, Waughtown Church was going to rebuild. They moved from Waughtown Street to our current location at 838 Moravia Street, and bought some land from the orphan home. The school was also across the street from there, so this would have been a hub of black society for this part of the county. The old Belview School closed around 1917, and the new Belview School opened on Moravia Street across from the school and next to the orphanage. The new Belview School was a Rosenwald school. This is Julius Rosenwald, who basically helped to build schools all over the South for black children. And here is the 1917 Belview School. Blacks gave some of the money, and the Rosenwald gave money also. That's the back of the school. And here's a picture of some of the students of the Belview School. Some of the principals of the new Belview School were Professor W.R. Brown, Kay Howard of Howard Robertson Funeral Home, and Amanda Craig, whose husband Jim owned a store in Belview, and Will Foy served as the janitor. Carrie C. Bidding, or Carrie Cora Bidding, we see listed also as a teacher at the orphanage, was also a teacher in the area, and although she was blind, she was an amazing teacher of piano and history. The Belview School was a source of pride. We see on the left young men from the Cubs who were playing baseball beyond the school. We also see an article from 1922 when a dinner for ex-slaves was held at the Belview School. The Belview School closes. According to the late historian Mrs. Thompson, the Belview School closed when the Colored Orphanage moved and merged across town, and the school students dwindled. It then would serve as a home, a detention center, and finally as a community center and nursery. John C. Joyce and his wife, who was a Freeze also, established a home for boys in the school building. And we see an article from the 1930s where John C. Joyce is praised, as is his wife, for opening this school, and they also use it to make meals for prisoners of the local jail. The Belview Civic League was very concerned with the education of youth, and they started with the idea of opening a school for black children in the Belview community, and that was their first priority. We see their initial members, W. Wright, J. Grimes, Booth Crawford, Harry Pickard, Professor Harry Pickard, James Greer, Reverend Williamson, and Mrs. W. Grimes at the bottom. In the 50s, their effort was toward having a school opened in the center. in the old school. So they then instead had a rec center opened in the school. They proposed this to Mr. L.B. Hathaway to open a center for the children in the school, but they were told there wasn't any money to open a rec center in Belview. The people of Belview are not ones to settle for just anything, so instead they raised money themselves, the community chest fund, and they purchased 100 metal chairs, 3 stoves, piano, sports equipment, kitchen equipment, etc. for their youth. They also paid their staff. They brought coal in, etc. There was boxing, sewing, baseball, etc. We also know they would open up a kindergarten in the school. Some people that worked at that time were Mrs. Willie Grimes Wright, Mrs. Ella P. Gray, Mr. W. Tennyson, Mr. Fred Wagner was also a part of that. Miss Cora Williamson ran the daycare, the first preschool. And some of the leaders were Mrs. Shirley Pickard, Harry E. Pickard, Ella P. Gray, Frank Stafford, Ernest Riley, Ella McDuffie, Mildred Griffin, Hansel Hintz, Al Jones, James Price, Robert Eller, and Brian Mans. We also know that Mrs. Murray was also appointed as the first director in 1951, Mrs. Frances Pickard Murray. And we see in this picture Mrs. Frances Pickard Murray, Professor Harry Yvonne Pickard, Mrs. Beatrice Grimes Wright, Mr. Fred Wagner, and Mrs. Ella P. Gray. It was amazing to learn that after 1 year of the community opening and operating the Belview Rec Center, the city then found enough money in their budget to take over the center. The Civic League now put their effort toward getting a school opened in Belview. However, this was only halted by one thing, and that was integration. And so we find out that students from the Belview area would integrate the schools in the area in 1958, September, when 3 young kids went into Easton Elementary School. We see here Lovey Cooper and her daughter Rosalind, as well as Mrs. Mayrose Campbell Corley and her daughter Norma Corley, who integrated Easton Elementary School in 1958. Belview students were going to integrate Parkland High School, with Roscoe Burgess being the first black student to attend and finish Parkland High School. Mrs. Rachel J. Campbell, who was also a Belview native, was one of the first black teachers to also serve on the school staff, and she will serve as the longtime math department chair. And her great grandfather, Sterling Campbell, served on one of the early county school committees for black children. And he also married Lucy Harrison Allen. The class of 1968, some of those blacks were Wanda Mock Alderson, who moved to Detroit, Thurman Carter, Kenneth Cooper, George P. Crawford, who was a part of that class but would finish in 1970, Aaron Graham, Alan Key, Clifton Robinson, Christine Roebuck, and Jerry Wagner. Jerry was one of the first blacks to serve on the homecoming court. The next class would have been Leslie Booker, Norma Corley, Rosalind Cooper, Matthew Davis, Larry Hart, Trudy Starnes, and William Stevens. We see Norma Corley, who has written the Parkland Alma Mater school song. Belview Youth also integrated Hill Junior High School. There was also a nursery in the Belview Rec Center, and this program from 1965 is courtesy of Vernon Hart. And we see all these names of kids that we would know from Belview and First Waughtown. Belview Center, half was a nursery and half was the center. There was a wading pool in the back, and the staff used the vans from First Waughtown for field trips. There was also Boy Scouts at the center, and we see Mrs. Nellie Mansell, whose family was a longtime family from the since enslavement in the area, and the Banner family. And of course, the Civic League held parties there and events there as well. It was the center of social life. We see Harry Holman here, uh, and he recalls hosting dances at the center. In the early 1980s, the Civic League led their Belview community members in petitioning the board for a new building. And the new center was completed in the spring of 1983, and the Civic League hosted services to dedicate the building on June 23rd, 1983. Then, in April 2019, Councilman James Taylor, with the help of many citizens from Belview and First Waughtown, announced that the third building was being built in Belview. The third is a $3 million addition to the second building, which is also the current building. With its roots in the 1866 Waughtown Freedmen School and is evidenced by the 1876 school report and the 1896 deed, the Belview Center is the oldest continual educational and center in Forsyth County for blacks, having served the community for over 145 years. Thank you.